Danielle Carter walked steadily across the sun-baked tarmac of LAX, the soles of her black heels clicking softly against the concrete. The morning heat rose in visible waves, but she didn't flinch. Her outfit was sharp, dark slacks, tailored, blouse, subtle makeup, but there was nothing showy about her. Two security guards followed a few steps behind, silent and professional. Ahead, the sleek private jet waited on the runway, engines purring at idle. Everything was ready for takeoff. Well, almost everything. At the base of the stairs stood Martin. Blake, arms crossed, posture stiff, jaw set. He was the pilot, seasoned, meticulous, and used to dealing with high-profile passengers. And clearly, he'd already made his judgment. "The jet is reserved for an important executive," he said, tone flat and eyes scanning her like she might be lost. Danielle didn't flinch. She also didn't run through her credentials or raise her voice. Instead, she reached into her structured leather bag, pulled out a thin black tablet, and held it out, wordlessly, to Marcus Lane, the airport's director of operations, who had just arrived after getting the security team's call. Marcus tapped in a code, paused and looked from the screen to Martin. "She is the executive," he said firmly. "Danielle Carter, CEO and founder." He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment sank fast. Martin's face lost all color as realization hit. He stood motionless, arms now hanging at his sides. Then came the part he hadn't anticipated, the quiet, unceremonious end to his role. Marcus didn't hesitate. "You're dismissed, effective immediately." There was a finality to the words that left no room for argument. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't even look angry, just focused, already moving past the scene while the rest of the staff hurried to recover from the tense moment. She boarded the aircraft without another glance at Martin, who stood alone, his reality rearranged by one brutal truth. He had underestimated someone who had built herself from the ground up. He didn't know it then, but that moment would shake him awake. For Danielle, it wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about clarity, and something bigger was setting into motion for both of them. As the door of the jet sealed shut behind her, Danielle Carter found herself finally alone. She slid into the plush seat by the window, keeping her back straight and shoulders loose, though the day had already pressed too many thoughts into her mind. Outside, the sky stretched wide and cloudless over Los Angeles, a hard blue that held no warmth. She looked out silently as the aircraft began to taxi. Her reflection in the window barely moved, but inside, everything stirred. What happened on the tarmac wasn't new. That kind of thing had just gotten quieter over the years, more polished, dressed up in casual tones and subtle expressions. The pilot's assumption, the way he said, "important executive," still rang in her head. It wasn't rage that stuck with her, it was the persistence of it all. After everything, after years building a company from scratch, leading teams through challenges, earning respect from the toughest rooms, she still had to prove she belonged. Without fail. The engines roared gently, lifting the jet into the sky. Danielle leaned back, eyes fixed on the clouds now forming as they crossed into higher altitude. She didn't need to remind herself of the weight she carried. It was always there, close, like a second skin. Her victories weren't just professional, they were personal, generational. Every room she entered came with ghosts whispering stories of being overlooked, unheard, brushed aside. And still, she went in. As the hours passed and the plane began, its descent into Philadelphia's airspace, where an important meeting with international investors was set to take place, her mind shifted gears. She'd been here before, not in this exact room, but in rooms just like it, full of tailor-made suits, confident voices, numbers projected on screens. Only this time, she wasn't just pitching a business. Today, she stood for every person still, waiting for their shot, for a system that needed rethinking from the root. She pulled out her tablet and began sketching notes with her stylus. Not flashy ideas, just intentional, careful moves. She didn't need to surprise anyone with brilliance. Her quiet strategy, built from years of listening and watching, would be enough. Danielle closed her eyes briefly and inhaled deep. The discomfort, the reminders, even the silence, they were all part of the story, just not the final chapter. After being fired at LAX in front of colleagues and strangers alike, Martin Blake went home with his shoulders squared and his jaw tight, telling himself it was a misunderstanding, something temporary. He still wore the uniform jacket for the first few days, even though he had nowhere to go. There was a quiet anger brewing under the surface, mixed with disbelief. How could decades of experience disappear in under 5 minutes? It didn't sit right. Something in him wanted to fight back. He started sending emails to former contacts, digging through old records, hoping to find something that would make him feel justified. He watched the footage from that morning again and again, trying to spot a wrinkle in procedure. Maybe he'd followed protocol too strictly. Maybe all he'd done was take his job seriously, and someone didn't like how it looked. But the more Martin looked, the more things shifted unexpectedly. He stumbled across articles, complaints, written statements, stories from black women in aviation, pilots, flight attendants, mechanics, stories about double checks that only happened to certain people, credentials questioned while others passed freely, quiet doubts voiced loudly at just the wrong time. Some of the stories felt eerily familiar. Against his better judgment, he reached out to a few of the women quoted in those reports, not as an accuser, but as someone who needed to understand. What started as short interviews turned into longer conversations, late-night phone calls, uncomfortable exchanges where he said very little and just listened. Some were gracious, a few weren't. Most were tired, and slowly something started to break open inside him. He began to realize that the gut feeling he trusted so often during security checks wasn't neutral, that what he'd always defended as following standard procedure hit differently when you were always the one being questioned. One woman said, "Every time someone paused at my name tag, I felt like I was flying through turbulence, even on the ground." He wrote that line down. Martin sat in silence for long stretches now, not out of guilt, at least not only that, but from a deep uncertainty. For the first time, he wasn't trying to prove he'd been right. He was trying to understand what he'd never seen before, and inside that discomfort, something stubborn and honest began to grow. The idea that real respect starts with unlearning. At the headquarters of Violite, a startup she had built from scratch in Atlanta, Danielle Carter sat at the edge of a long conference table, reviewing the upcoming travel itinerary on her tablet. Meetings in Berlin, Brussels, and Amsterdam would run back-to-back over the next 2 weeks. Her plan was clear: expand into Europe through strong partnerships rooted in ethical tech and green innovation, all led by teams that reflected the world's true diversity. That meant more than aiming for net zero targets. It meant building pipelines led by women of color, pushing against systems that had long dismissed voices like hers. The idea wasn't to ask for space in someone else's vision. It was to rewrite the vision itself. Still, the deeper she moved into the European corporate landscape, the more the cracks began to show. Some were small, conference invites that had once been confirmed seemed to vanish without a trace, or were suddenly rescheduled indefinitely. Emails were returned with strange delays. Journalists who seemed eager to cover her work grew vague when deadlines approached, their initial excitement replaced with polite distance. More than once, investors praised her data in private, but hesitated to sign publicly. Danielle pressed forward, steady like always, but nothing quite hit the same as what happened in Berlin. Her team had spent over 3 months preparing a keynote there, an event meant to position Violight as a serious global player in renewable microgrid solutions for underserved communities. Schematics, case studies, bilingual slides, the whole production was airtight, or so they thought. When she stepped onto the stage and the screen behind her flickered to show incorrect figures and unrelated charts, the tech crew looked just as stunned as she was. Her moment had been undermined. But Danielle didn't stop. With measured breath, she closed the laptop, stepped forward, and spoke from memory. She told the story behind the numbers, the people, the places, the impact that didn't need a slide to feel real. The crowd rose to their feet, loud applause, genuine awe. Still, as the lights lifted, Danielle spotted a familiar face near the back. Jack Ramsey, a former advisor she had cut ties with years ago after a quiet fallout, smiling, watching her like the sabotage hadn't been a failed jab. And she knew then, success didn't silence everyone. Sometimes it attracted those who'd rather see you stumble just to feel tall by comparison. But she also knew this wasn't the end. She was just getting started. Martin Blake sat at his kitchen table, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. The page was mostly blank except for the sentence he had written and deleted 3 times over. This is hard to admit, but I see it now. He wasn't sure where to start or who'd even listen, but he knew he had to speak, not defend, not explain away, just acknowledge what he'd ignored for too long. 2 weeks earlier, he would have rolled his eyes at the idea of writing an open letter. Now, after everything he'd learned and the conversations he couldn't forget, something inside him wouldn't let him stay quiet anymore. So he wrote, not with polish, not to sound smart, but to be honest. He talked about how power worked subtly in the flight industry, how he had benefited from it without even realizing, how people had warned him, women especially, and how he had brushed those warnings off as exaggerations. He didn't name Danielle, but the moment that changed, everything was woven into every paragraph. The letter went live on a Thursday morning. He didn't expect much. By Friday night, it was being shared by pilots, activists, and journalists across the country. Some praised his reflection, while others questioned the timing. A few accused him of trying to clean his name without facing any real consequences. Martin didn't fight the feedback. He read the criticism carefully and kept quiet. For once, he wasn't there to explain himself. 30,000 feet above ground, heading toward Chicago for a quiet industry roundtable, Danielle read the letter from her seat near the back of the plane. The cabin was dim, crew lights low, and most passengers were dozing off. As she scrolled through the long message on her tablet, something tightened in her chest. She didn't expect her name to be there, and it wasn't. But the story was. She lived it, after all. She wanted to be skeptical. People crafted dramatic apologies all the time. Regret had a way of becoming performance, and she'd been used too many times as a symbol in someone else's growth story. But there was something raw in Martin's writing, something that felt like the kind of reckoning people don't always survive publicly. Danielle closed the tablet and leaned back. Maybe, she thought, there is space, not for forgetting, but for repair. Some walls had cracks wide enough to let light through. In the middle of a chilly night in Brussels, just 3 days before Violight was set to unveil their latest clean energy prototype, Danielle's phone rang. The caller was her European operations coordinator. The engineer they had trusted for over a decade, Maya Green, hadn't shown up to a scheduled systems test. Then came the bigger hit. Maya was gone. Her badge access had been used early that morning, but security footage showed her leaving the lab with 2 hard cases and a laptop bag. The backup servers had been wiped clean of the latest design files. Danielle stood in silence, the hotel room dim and cold. Her heartbeat wasn't loud, but it was steady, the kind of pace you develop when panic is a luxury you gave up long ago. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She just repeated Maya's name once, almost like a question to the air. By morning, the news had reached the entire core team. No details, just that Maya was no longer with the company. Whispers circled, of course. People talked when the silence got too loud. Danielle kept her expression tight and her voice calm during all meetings, but inside there was a new kind of ache. This betrayal didn't come from a rival or a skeptical investor or a gatekeeper in a suit. It came from someone who had stood beside her for 15 years, through early failures, 30-hour coding sprints, and late-night ramen in the first basement office. She kept waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning, replaying scenes with Maya over and over. After the 4th sleepless night, she stopped asking why and started asking what now. Danielle called an internal summit with the junior engineers, some fresh out of college, others finally stepping into real leadership chances. She laid out what was lost, what they still had, and what needed to be rebuilt. No sugarcoating, no lectures, just plain talk and a clear timeline. They would restart. The prototype, the modeling, everything. And something happened. The room, once full of hesitation, slowly filled with voices. Ideas came, solutions rushed forward even before the coffee cooled. Danielle watched them, not to manage, but to lead, not to control, but to set direction. She became sharper, more precise, still holding the pain close, but now using it. She wasn't just resisting anymore. She was building again. The conference hall in Amsterdam was still buzzing when Danielle stepped away from the main floor and into the quiet of a backstage lounge. The International Clean Tech Expo had been a whirlwind. 3 panels, 2 press interviews, and endless hands to shake. But what really stuck with her was one meeting that hadn't been on the public schedule. A group of major investors from the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States had offered a deal too big to ignore. A merger worth hundreds of millions, with access to dozens of global hubs and full infrastructure support. There was just one catch. Vialight's brand, its story, even its leadership style, would need to be adjusted. They never used the word erased, but that was the shape of it. Danielle returned to her hotel in Lisbon that night, stomach tight, the figures from the offer echoing in her mind. The kind of money that could expand the company 10 times over. But every clause in that proposal came at a cost. Less community control, fewer commitments to worker equity, a rebranding that dropped the clear stance about black and brown women leading innovation. Her mission would survive, maybe, but only in diluted form, wrapped in someone else's language, press-released into something unrecognizable. She met with her advisory circle in the hotel's quiet lounge, 6 of them, close allies she'd trusted for years. They debated every angle of the merger, laying out best-case scenarios, fallback plans, and the long-term risks. For hours, ideas filled the space, but one thing followed her throughout the conversation: the stillness under her doubt. Somewhere, beneath the pressure and the worry, something inside her had already decided. After everyone left, Danielle sat alone, facing the window that overlooked the quiet city. The sky wasn't quite dark, the last bit of winter light dragging across the rooftops. That's when she said it aloud, softly. No. She turned down the deal the next morning. When she gave the final answer, some of the investors were stunned. Others were polite and distant. More than one exited the call without a word. Still, Danielle felt no hesitation. Growth would come, maybe slower now, but the roots would be real. She hadn't built Vialight just to watch it be reshaped into something safe. She hadn't carved out space only to give it back. Holding the line wasn't easy, but she didn't leave Atlanta to become someone else's footnote. Martin Blake was back in Atlanta, living a quieter life, teaching the occasional aviation safety seminar and keeping mostly to himself. His big letter had made waves, but eventually the noise died down. He liked it better this way, less attention, more time to think. Then, out of nowhere, he got a message from a small progressive group working out of Los Angeles. They were building a new diversity initiative inside a regional airline and wanted him to come on board, not as a figurehead, but as someone who had seen both sides of the system and could help change it. At first, he didn't answer. The idea of standing up again in front of people, trying to talk about race and power without sounding like he had all the answers, made his stomach twist. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't about being an expert. It was about being honest, even when it hurt. After a few restless nights, he called them back and said yes. He started slow, just 1 or 2 workshops a month. Then came panel talks, small group sessions, and one-on-one conversations that stretched. Late into the evening, Martin didn't preach. He told stories about what he thought he knew, how things felt at the time, and what he missed. People listened because he didn't try to wrap things up neatly. He left space for mistakes, both his and theirs. Word of his work traveled fast. At a conference in Chicago, a young black engineer mentioned Martin's name in passing as someone who doesn't make you feel talked down to. Danielle Carter, sitting a few rows away, heard it. Later that evening, another colleague pulled her aside and shared a clip from one of his sessions, a short speech where Martin spoke openly about listening without needing to fix, and about unlearning the need to be the authority at all times. Danielle watched quietly, not sharing the clip, not saying anything. There was something familiar in his voice now, not the old, cool distance, but the weight of someone trying to rebuild trust in pieces. She didn't feel ready to reach out. The space she'd carved between them still protected something important inside her. Still, she found herself wondering, not if they'd meet again, but when. And when that day came, what kind of story the silence between them would finally tell. One rainy Monday morning in Atlanta, not long after the team had closed a quarter with steady growth, Firelight was hit with something no one saw coming, a surprise audit. It came wrapped in polite language and official stamps, but the chaos it unleashed spread fast. Within 24 hours, logistics bottlenecks stalled shipments, vendor payments froze, and several internal departments were told to prepare detailed compliance reports. At first, people thought it was a standard review. But then, files went. Missing old contract drafts somehow landed on someone else's desk, and whispers of fraud trickled through group chats faster than anyone could shut them down. Danielle Carter knew this wasn't routine. By the end of the second day, she traced the request back through the maze of legal filings, and the pieces started falling into place. The audit was technically legal, yes, but it had been quietly triggered by Simon Ellis, a former partner who'd left the company 2 years earlier after a bitter disagreement over expansion ethics. He hadn't spoken to her directly since, but his name had popped up recently in conversations with investors. Firelight turned down. Now it made sense. Danielle stayed calm on the surface, but the weight of it pressed harder each night. Staff meetings stretched longer. Exhaustion crept in. Her team began looking to her for bold decisions, fast fixes. Some wanted her to lawyer up hard. Others pushed for public statements. But Danielle stood firm. Quick reactions might calm headlines, but they didn't fix what was broken beneath. Instead, she called together a group of problem solvers from inside the company, a mix of compliance staff, senior engineers, finance leads, and even 2 operations interns who'd shown great instincts during a past crisis. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But they set up camp in an unused conference room, mapped every gap, and reviewed every rumor like it mattered. By the end of the week, they uncovered the weak spots Simon had hoped to exploit. They updated internal processes, reinforced digital Security corrected the paperwork trail and quietly shut down the flare-up before it became a fire. Danielle didn't celebrate. She'd learned too much for that. Instead, she walked the floor the next morning, checking in with each department. She didn't preach or pretend to have all the answers, just looked people in the eye and reminded them they were still standing. And so was Violite. The private summit in Zurich wasn't Danielle's usual scene. Suits everywhere, quiet conversations, over high-end wine and a level of quiet power that made even successful founders sit straighter. She had been invited mainly for her work with next-gen energy models, but once she arrived, it became clear that the room held more than just clean tech. Enthusiasts, old banks, new players, legacy names, all sitting in one space, watching each other carefully. On the second evening, after a long day of panels and small talk, Danielle found herself at a dinner table beside Elise Moreau. The name alone carried weight. A French magnate known for building one of Europe's largest transport tech empires, Elise wasn't exactly famous for warmth. Her image in the press was one of strategy over sentiment, of calculated decisions with little space for personal connection. The meal started quiet. They passed the serving trays without much eye contact, extracted small observations from the event. Nothing overly personal. But then, halfway through the salmon course, Elise set her fork down and said without looking up, "I was born into an empire I was taught to conquer, but never to belong to." Danielle didn't answer right away. The phrase hung there, more real than anything else all night. She wasn't expecting to relate to this woman, not like that, but suddenly she saw it. Another leader standing just outside the gates of the world she helped shape. Someone who, like her, knew how lonely it felt to build something powerful and still feel the ground shift beneath your feet whenever you tried to own the space fully. By the end of dinner, Elise made a proposal. A new joint venture across Europe, a Persuise clean energy conglomerate built to integrate transport, power and infrastructure in a way that could shape policy and scale faster than any one company could manage alone. The catch was steep, full integration, a unified brand, and Violite would become part of something bigger, but not something uniquely Danielle's. Back in her room later that night, Danielle couldn't sleep. She kept replaying their conversations. Not just the business pitch, but the pieces of memory, of belonging, of how much one could give up chasing growth. She didn't say yes, not yet. But part of her understood now that evolving didn't always mean letting go. Sometimes it meant deciding how much of yourself had to stay at the center, even as everything around you got larger. Back in Atlanta, the air felt different, less sharp, more grounded. After months of traveling, negotiating, and questioning which moves actually mattered, Danielle Carter finally returned with a plan that felt like her. No mergers, no watered-down brand, just something real. She poured everything into planning. The Ascent Fund, a new investment platform designed specifically for Black women founders in tech and sustainability. It wasn't just about money. It was about time, networks, and mentorship. About removing the quiet no's and closed doors. She had faced herself. The launch event was held at the same Midtown Community Center where she'd pitched her first solar storage prototype years earlier. That felt right. On the morning of the event, the line of applicants wrapped around the corner and spilled onto the sidewalk. Some had driven in from Alabama. One woman came from Detroit on a night, and Bus, sleeping only a few hours, stretched across 2 seats and holding a printed-out pitch deck in her lap. Inside, the energy was something else. Laughter, nerves, notebooks flipping open, kids waiting with snacks while their moms rehearsed elevator speeches. Danielle spent most of the day listening. She didn't hide behind the process. She sat in, the front row, nodding as young founders told stories about self-funding on credit cards, building apps in public libraries, growing teams in living rooms. Over and over again, she saw reflections of her younger self, hungry, tired, ready to fight anyway, some polished, some raw, all of them sharp. By the time the last pitch ended, the room erupted into applause. Volunteers were clearing cups and rearranging chairs, press crews packing up their gear. Danielle slipped backstage into a corner dressing room where a bowl of tea bags and half a sandwich waited beside her folded coat. And that's where it hit her. Not like a big dramatic wave, but soft, steady, impossible to ignore. She sat down, leaned over the sink, shoulders shaking just a little. For the first time in months, her tears weren't from exhaustion or frustration. They came from this full, quiet realization. This mattered. This, and not some global headline or boardroom nod. These young women were going to lead next, in their own names. Danielle wiped her face, stood up, and smiled at her own reflection. For the first time in a long while, she believed in legacy. Not as something she'd leave behind, but as something she was building right here, right now. Camilla Jennings had been reporting for nearly 3 decades. She had covered war zones, congressional hearings, and tech scandals that shook entire companies. Now, in what she called the second half of her career, she was turning her focus to something harder to photograph. Subtle power dynamics, the kinds of discrimination that didn't leave fingerprints but carved real scars. So when she started looking into the culture inside major American firms, one name kept popping up: Danielle Carter. At first, Camilla figured it would be a standard profile: female founder, respected in both investor circles and grassroots networks, running one of the few major tech companies led by a black woman. But the deeper she looked, the clearer it became that Danielle's story didn't wrap neatly. Her emails to Danielle went unanswered at first. Then after a week, a simple reply: "I'm open to a conversation, on my terms only." They met at a quiet co-op cafe downtown, far from corporate offices and away from curious eyes. Danielle didn't dress for press. No branding, no makeup crew, just a hoodie and jeans, laptop in tow. She listened more than she spoke. Camilla asked pointed questions about boardroom culture, investor bias, and being underestimated even after consistent success. Danielle answered carefully. She shared what mattered, skipped the headlines others might chase. She spoke of decisions made in silence, of the exhaustion that came with always explaining her presence in spaces built without her in mind. When Camilla requested a recorded interview for publication, Danielle paused. She agreed on 3 conditions: full transparency, no editorial twists, and final say before anything went live. Camilla agreed, though she left Danielle with one note before packing up her recorder. "Just know," Camilla said softly, sliding her notebook into her bag, "your silence can also be read as a kind of message." Danielle didn't flinch. "I've learned," she replied, "that silence can carry truth. So can boundaries." After the meeting, Camilla left with more questions, not fewer. And maybe that was the point. Danielle wasn't trying to be a symbol or a cautionary tale. She wasn't curating her pain for clicks. She was a woman who had learned, through wins and wounds, that sometimes the boldest move is protecting the version of your story no one else gets to shape. The public would read the article. Some would read between the lines. Only a few might understand what Danielle chose not to say, and why. Nobody had heard from Mariah Benson in months, not since the failed rollout of the thermal circuit upgrade that nearly cost Violight a major contract. After that, she had quietly stepped back, turned down interviews, and disappeared from team meetings. People assumed she moved on to another company or maybe switched fields altogether, which wasn't uncommon in their line of work. Disappointment had a way of rewriting career paths overnight. So when Danielle Carter got a message from Mariah, out of the blue requesting 30 minutes to present a new clean energy prototype, she was surprised. There was no sales pitch attached, just a file, a few words about improved output and safety metrics, and a line that read, "I know what happened last time, but I think this matters." Danielle read it twice, leaned back in her chair, and narrowed her eyes. She remembered how the last project ended, rushed timelines, a few overlooked tests, and a public apology that landed directly on her desk. Trust wasn't something she gave freely anymore, but something in Mariah's tone, simple, humble, direct, pulled at her, so she cleared an hour and told her engineers to listen. No promises, just space. The following Tuesday, Mariah walked into the conference room with a newer, leaner version of the prototype. The room was cool, quiet. Most of the team had been part of the old rollout and still carried that weight. But as Mariah talked, her calm and focus began to shift the mood. She explained the redesign clearly, owned her past missteps without excuses, and laid out performance data that had quietly been vetted during her time away. It wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. The numbers spoke. The questions came, intense, but fair, and Mariah didn't flinch. By the time she clicked off the presentation, the skepticism had turned into quiet respect. Danielle watched from the back, saying nothing until everyone left. Then she walked over, looked Mariah in the eye, and nodded. "I'm in," she said, "but this time we do it right. No shortcuts." Mariah didn't smile, just gave a small nod and whispered, "Thank you." By letting her back in, Danielle wasn't just reviving a project, she was sticking to something deeper. That leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about believing people can learn, fall, and still do something extraordinary. The new prototype had promise, but what mattered even more was what it now stood for. The cabin in Washington's Cascade Mountains was simple. Wood walls, no cell signal, no distractions. The retreat wasn't advertised online or posted anywhere. Public, just a quiet gathering passed along through word of mouth, people needing time, space, and maybe a little peace. Danielle Carter came with no expectations, only the hope that some kind of stillness might show up after the months of non-stop work, launches, and decisions that seemed louder than her own thoughts. On the second morning, they hiked at sunrise, through a mist-covered trail where trees leaned like old friends, and the sound of a distant flute drifted out from someone's small speaker tucked in a jacket pocket. There wasn't any talking, just breathing, walking, grounding. It was there, standing near the edge of a quiet cliff, that a memory returned. Her sister, Naomi. Neither of them would ever be able to say exactly when the silence between them started. It had stretched slowly, pulled long by small moments. Missed calls, different values, words spoken too sharply, and apologies never made. They'd skipped each other's birthdays for 3 years now, then stopped forwarding family photos altogether. Danielle had buried the ache beneath work because that's how she stayed upright. But something about the stillness in that place cracked the surface. Grief didn't always come yelling. Sometimes it came in soft waves, whispering, "You missed her," when no one was around to watch you admit it. That afternoon, by the fire pit behind the main lodge, she pulled out a notebook and started writing. No performances, no defenses, just a letter. She wrote about old bike rides, the road trips with their mom, the time Naomi stitched up a pillow for her first dorm room as a surprise. She didn't blame, she didn't beg, she just said she missed her sister, and if Naomi ever wanted to talk even about nothing, she'd be ready. When the letter was done, she released it into the world with no expectation. Mailed it the next day from a tiny post office along the highway. Then she walked outside, hands in her coat pockets, and stared out across the foggy hills. She didn't know if Naomi would answer. But something important had shifted. A locked doctor had opened just a little, and sometimes even a quiet step across a broken bridge is how healing begins. In Chicago, the annual Green Tech Expo had drawn thousands to McCormick Place, investors, engineers, journalists, and students eager to see who was building the future. Violite's booth was scheduled for the final afternoon slot, right between a global ocean cleanup project and a panel on carbon credits. Danielle Carter had spent the morning running through demos, quietly proud of the team's progress since launching their community solar prototype. Everything had been checked twice. Nothing seemed out of place. But then, about an hour before they were due to present, things started unraveling fast. The primary display screen went black. Files that were supposed to run the simulation wouldn't open. Pages of code gave bizarre errors none of the engineers recognized. When Danielle called for backup, half the crew didn't pick up. Delayed at the airport due to weather, 2 others dealing with a missing shipment from earlier that week. Panic hung in the air. Whispers started among nearby booths. One intern said they saw someone near Violite's table the night before, messing around with wires under the pretense of helping with setup. Nothing was confirmed, but the timing felt too perfect to be accidental. There wasn't time to investigate or blame. Danielle had to decide, pull the plug or go forward, messy and uncertain. Before she could choose, Mariah Benson rolled up her sleeves, cracked open the prototype's casing, and started working. No drama, no announcements, just a quiet urgency. As she rewired parts using pieces from a drone stabilizer someone had in their backpack. At one point, she even stripped the power cable from a nearby phone charger to make a circuit functional. The others followed her lead, handing parts, rewriting bits of code by hand as screens flickered back to life. It wasn't polished, but it worked. When the moment came, Mariah pushed the prototype forward, connected the final wire, and ran the basic simulation. It blinked, whirred, and powered on with just enough data to show how energy moved through a local grid. The panel lights dimmed, sparked once, then steadied. The crowd was quiet for a second, before rising to their feet in applause. Danielle stood off to the side, watching. Her pulse was still high, but as she looked at Mariah, face smudged, hands shaking slightly from stress. What she felt most was pride. Real leadership doesn't always look neat. And trust, it's something you keep earning, moment by moment. Camilla Jennings sat across from the editor-in-chief of the Herald Tribune, her jaw clenched as he explained, politely but firmly, that the investigative series she had spent 6 months working on would not be published. He used words like timing, sensitivity, and pending internal review, but she knew what it really meant. Sponsors had complained, board members had made calls, and her reporting centered on racism, power, and quiet retaliation in elite. Business circles had made people nervous. She was told to take an internal break, the kind that puts everything on hold without firing you outright. Her access was cut off. Emails bounced. Her badge no longer opened the newsroom doors, and the story, the one she had chased across cities, fact-checked and written with all the care she could manage, it was locked in a digital drawer. For now, unreachable. Danielle Carter heard about it late one evening from a producer friend. She wasn't surprised, not really. Impactful stories about uncomfortable truths rarely escaped without bruises. But knowing Camilla had put herself on the line for it, that hit her differently. What started as a profile had grown into something else, something honest. Respect had settled between them, quietly and firmly. So Danielle called her. No script, no PR filters. Just a straight offer. If you're still willing, I'll help get it out there. Independent media, podcasts, public forums, whatever you need. We won't let this vanish. You didn't do all that work for it to sit in some server. Camilla hesitated. She had spent decades in journalism, Going outside official channels wasn't her style, but these days, the lines between truth and power were blurry, and maybe it was time to draw new ones. "All right," she said, "but we do it right, no cutting corners." From then on, they weren't reporter and subject anymore, they were partners. Over coffee in quiet cafes and late-night Zoom calls, they reviewed the story piece by piece. Names were double-checked, data verified again. Not to please investors, but to honor the voices inside the piece, those who had risked their jobs, reputations, and safety to speak. They knew this path would raise pushback, maybe even threats, but they agreed on one thing. The truth didn't belong to handlers. It belonged to those bold enough to hold it up, even when institutions turned away. When Kevin Lang resurfaced, it came with the kind of polished confidence that made people hopeful and suspicious at the same time. He walked into the Violight office like he still owned a piece of it, not legally, but in that subtle, looming way some former partners manage to linger long after the paperwork is done. This time, he brought something new, a proposed merger, with a group of European investors who had deep pockets and global reach. On the surface, it looked good, really good. Expansion into new markets, streamlined distribution, even more research funding. Kevin framed it as the next logical step, scaling impact, he called it, with slides and bullet points to match. But Danielle Carter had learned too much in the last few years to take anything at face value. She sat with her legal team the next day and started reading between the promises. That's when the cracks appeared. Pages of fine print, clauses that changed control of intellectual property, language that could break apart her current team under the new restructuring model. And nowhere at all, was there any guarantee that Violight's original commitment to community-driven energy solutions would survive the transition. Danielle didn't just weigh the numbers. She took the proposal to her executive board, yes, but also spoke to the engineers in the break room and called her mentor in Detroit, who had been in the energy industry for over 25 years. Finally, late one night, she sat alone in her office, rereading the company's mission statement, something she hadn't looked at in maybe 2 years, but had once helped write by hand. It was more than a document. It was memory, vision, her. Team's DNA on paper, so when Kevin called the next morning, already assuming her agreement, she cut in gently but firmly. "I'm going to pass on the merger," she said. "We're building something bigger than just another product line, and this deal, well, it costs us more than we gain." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Kevin said, not unkindly, "You always did like the harder road." Danielle smiled. "Sometimes the harder road's the only one that ends where you're meant to go." With that choice, she unhooked Violight from its last tie to an older chapter, one shaped by compromises she no longer had to make. This was about more than growth. It was about staying honest with what they'd started in the first place. The ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta was packed. The annual summit for emerging sustainable industries had become one of the biggest business events in the country, drawing founders, venture capitalists, and media from all over. Danielle Carter was one of the headlining speakers, a recognition that came after years of hard work, setbacks, and steady leadership, but even as she walked up the steps to the main stage with a calm smile, she felt the pressure. Not nerves exactly, just the weight of eyes that weren't always sure whether to root for her or look for a slip. Midway through the panel discussion, just as the moderator opened the floor for responses from the audience, Felicia Rhodes stood up. Felicia was once Danielle's mentor, sharp, respected, and not shy about shaking rooms. But in recent years, the tone between them had shifted. Competition had replaced mentorship, and what seemed like professional distance sometimes felt more like hostility. Felicia smiled as she took the mic, but her words came laced with barbs. Danielle, always so composed, she began. You speak well, I'll give you that. But when we really break down outcomes, is it strategy or just the right window, the right labels, the right timing? Sometimes I wonder if your company stands more on trends than results. Some in the crowd laughed quietly. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Danielle could feel the room's tension rise, a few hesitant claps, some murmurs. But she stayed, seated, eyes steady. When they handed her the mic, she didn't raise her voice, didn't roll her eyes or snap back. She just leaned forward a little and spoke clearly. I appreciate the question. Let me tell you what's not a trend: staying. Solvent for over 6 years in clean tech while employing people across 5 states. Pivoting under pressure when the market shifts. Pushing innovation without burning out my team. We've had failures, yes, but we stayed, we built, and we've grown through them all. She glanced across the crowd, not at Felicia. And if consistency, accountability, and purpose are fashionable, then I hope we wear them well for years to come. The room went quiet. Then, slowly but steadily, applause began to build. Her words hit social media within minutes, trending across platforms. But as Danielle stepped away from the mic, what mattered to her wasn't the attention. It was the moment itself. In a space that tried to shrink her, she had stood her ground, not louder, just stronger. At a regional clean energy forum in Denver, Danielle Carter spotted a familiar face across the room. Max Donovan. She hadn't seen him in person since that messy fallout almost 4 years earlier. Back then, he had been part of an early advisory group tied to Violite's launch, brilliant in his analysis, terrible at boundaries, and even worse when things didn't go his way. The trust between them had shattered after a few missteps that Danielle always suspected weren't accidents, even if nothing had been proven outright. So when she saw him standing by a booth on the far end of the exhibit hall, slightly older, salt in his beard, wearing the badge of a respected consultant now working with federal agencies on energy policy, her first instinct was to walk the other way. But Max didn't avoid eye contact. He actually walked over slowly, hands visible, no swagger, no quick words. "Danielle," he said, stopping just short of her, "I know this probably isn't the moment, but I wanted to say something straight." She waited, not warm, but not walking off either. "I've been around long enough to admit I mishandled things back then, not just with you, but with the team. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know I've been looking into patterns of interference, quiet sabotage, and some of the data leads back to people who were once in your orbit, including a few names neither of us thought to question back then." Her stomach tightened. She hated this kind of conversation, where part of your brain wants to stay guarded and another part wants to believe someone's actually changed. Still, something in his tone felt real. "And if you'd be open to it," he continued, "I'd like to help you figure out what's still messing with your systems from the inside. No contracts, just cooperation. You don't owe me trust, but you might want another set of eyes." Danielle took a long breath. Years of distance had built strong walls, but she didn't want those walls to blind her either. Maybe this was worth the risk, even if only as an experiment in controlled collaboration. "All right," she said. "You help, nothing more for now." That one choice cracked open a new chapter at Violite, not built on forgiveness, but on paying attention, on using old mistakes as a map, not for regret, but for redesign. Danielle Carter had spent the last few months navigating one of the hardest decisions of her career. An official offer had landed on her desk, a formal invitation to take over leadership of Verena Group, a massive European energy conglomerate headed by Isabel Becker, an industry giant with a polished reputation and nearly unlimited resources. From the outside, it looked like a dream job, total access to billions in funding, international sway, and a shining role on the world stage. But something about it didn't sit right. Danielle read through the agreement more than once. Every word was clean, every term generous. Still it felt off, not corrupt, just cold. The things she cared most about, community innovation, shared ownership, long-term equity, were buried deep beneath corporate boards and performance metrics. She imagined herself sitting in a high tower in Zurich, holding power but losing the soul of everything she had spent the last decade building. So she said no, and it hurt. Turning down that kind of offer came at a cost. Investors pulled back. A few media outlets ran with half-baked theories about her future. Still, she knew what she needed to do. Out of that refusal came something new. She launched Horizon Seed, a small but ambitious global incubator based out of Seattle. It was nothing like Verena Group, lean, hands-on, and intended for founders who never got the spotlight, especially those working in overlooked regions and communities. The funding came slowly, pieced together by a few steadfast donors, a couple of university partners, and some personal sacrifice. But it was enough to start moving. When Horizon Seed held its official launch event at the Museum of History and Industry, the main hall was filled, not with celebrities or executives, but with young entrepreneurs, retired activists, and engineers, who had scrapped together big ideas in tight corners. Danielle stood in front of them all, not just proud, but steady, tired in a real way, but more grounded than she had felt in a long time. She looked out at the crowd, took a breath, and said, "Having wings isn't enough. You've got to know where to land." The room slowly rose to its feet, applause echoing above the old wood floors. In that moment, it became clear the journey was never about beating the system on its terms. It was always about drawing new lines, pulling others in, and proving that another way forward was not just possible, but already beginning.